I don't want to do too much of an intro because, traditionally my background was with fighters. I got really, really sick of them. At one stage of my career, when I started this business, for whatever reason, there was a lot of right timings with a lot of things, and it shot up really, really quickly. And I think at the time, I wasn't really ready to handle what that was like kind of having a business that was doing that. And I got really overwhelmed with my phone going off 24/7. And I remember just sitting there and thinking God, I can't stand all these athletes talking to me all the time, having all these questions and blah, blah, blah. I thought, what is the one thing that I can do where I'll never have to talk to anyone? I thought, you know what, I could probably go out to Mount Cootha and run for a few hours and then no one's going to contact. And that's pretty much how I got into running. And it's very, very funny. When I got into running, I found that there was a lot of similarities, funny enough, with the combat sports world. When I got into combat sports, there's this weird thing that they do, and you guys don't have to know what it is, but they all have to make a weight. So they're all weight classes, or say if someone's 70 kilos, they're never actually 70 kilos, they're about 90 kilos. And what they do, my job is to get 20 kilos off them and ridiculously dehydrate them, but keep them healthy. When you do that, there's a lot of things that happen to their physiology, and unfortunately people die doing it. It's a very, very high risk field. Not a lot of people do it. Not a lot of people want to do it because it's very high risk. Funny enough, when I came into running, there was a lot of similarities in the physiology from where I dealt with that to when I was dealing with ultra runners and triathletes and Ironman. So weirdly enough, in some weird convoluted way, the work that I spent years trying to figure out weight cutting and figure out how to make that better really, really helped me when we started getting into endurance work and working with Ironmans and idiots like Toby and then other ultra endurance athletes. So it was very, very interesting. And what I want to break down to you guys is the science of hydration. There's lots you can talk about when you talk about run nutrition. We're not going to go over fueling and carbs. We can go over that in another time and maybe talk about this after. But we're going to break down specifically hydration science for running. So the first few things that you need to appreciate are the things that will absolutely stuff up your race. And I'm sure you guys have raced, whether it's a half marathon all the way up to an ultra, you guys can all appreciate these. First is just not being fit. If you're not fit enough, you're not going to get it done. So obviously you all need to train. Next thing is not being fueled. I'm sure I have many a time. I'm sure you guys have hit the wall, you bonked out. Everyone knows what that feeling like. It sucks. You can avoid it by fueling up properly. If you don't have adequate mental strategies, we all know that. Everyone hits loops. No matter what distance you're running, you're going to hit a mental dip, and you need to have mental strategies to get out of that. The next thing is becoming excessively dehydrated. Then the next is that can lead to being excessively overheated. That's something that's very, very common when we live in the sauna, that is Brisbane. So you'll commonly see athletes who are coming in with overheating, heat exhaustion, heat stroke, things like that. Why I want to talk to you guys about dehydration and hydration is because it affects every single one of these things. So as we'll go over here, when you become dehydrated, your ability to be fit gets compromised. When you become dehydrated, your ability to fuel gets compromised. When you become dehydrated, it's very, very hard to be mentally tough and mentally sound. When you become dehydrated, you become a huge risk of overheating. So by just getting on top of this, you've put yourself in a favorable position to do better in that race. And the reason I like talking about this topic in particular is because the information that's out there, and trust me, I've only been running for 3-4 years, so I've tried to look for all of this information. There's not a lot of good stuff. And we're going to get into why some of you guys, this probably won't apply to as much, but for most of us who aren't elite athletes, it probably applies really, really well. So what I want you guys to leave knowing is, firstly, I want you guys to know what dehydration does and the role that hydration plays when you're running. How does it actually affect your performance? The factors that affect your ability to hydrate properly. How do you actually do it in a race? And the importance of managing your blood electrolyte levels during a race, which is, again, something that you're going to be very, very stretched finding good information on. Again, very, very, very final thing is I want you all to be able to walk out of this and go, okay, how do I actually start putting this into action? I'm going to give you this very, very simple strategy where you can leave this and go, okay, if I go on a run tomorrow, I can start putting this to practice. So very, very first thing, I guess it's important to talk about why hydration, and it's very well documented. We all live in Brisbane, we live in a sauna. You all appreciate that when we went for a run Monday, it was a lot harder than we go for a run in July or August. That's a lot to do with the temperature. Temperature, obviously, when it's hotter, we're going to sweat more. There's an obvious relationship between temperature and running performance. And we see that. If you document across marathon world record running times, they're generally set in very cool environments, which are more favorable to not overheating. So we see that all the time. This second graph is very, very interesting. Western States endurance race. They just did the lottery. No one here got in because there was one Aussie that I got in, I think, this year. So no one in this room got in. If you did, come talk to me afterwards. This is an interesting graph that shows the temperatures between 2006 and 2007. 2006 it was 36 degrees Celsius. 2007 it was 30 degrees Celsius. Between those two events, there was 50% more DNFs in the hotter year. And I think everyone who's ever run like an ultra run, whether it's 50 kilometers, 100 kilometers, 100 mile, if you've done it in hot, humid weather, you appreciate how hard that makes it and how much more effort you have to put in. So there's an obvious relationship between running performance and how well you can stay hydrated. Now, like Jamie said, we started in fighting, but I've been fortunate enough, we work with lots and lots of very, very, very elite runners and very, very elite Ironman, very, very elite cyclists. And I have found when we've collected data and we've gone through and we've done sweat testing, we've done sweat rate with all these guys, we're a very, very data-driven company. That's how we inform our decisions with our performance. I found that there's two types of runners. You don't need to worry so much about the salty sweat. We'll talk about that in a little bit, but there's two types of runners. There's runners that sweat heaps and there's runners that don't sweat that much. And every single one, bar maybe a couple of our very, very elite runners, are the low salt sweaters or the low sweaters. They don't seem to sweat as much. It just seems to be this type of genetic filtering that if you don't sweat as much, you seem to go a bit further in the sport. It's very interesting because in my other life, in combat sports, it's the complete opposite. If you sweat a lot, when I was competing in combat sports and I had to make weight, I could sit in a sauna for an hour and I could lose 3 kilos. And it was very, very good. I'd go step on the scales and I'd be light. I could drink it all back on and I could go fight. When it came to running, if I lose 3 liters in 1 hour, I have to keep running for another 12 hours. It makes my life very, very hard. So it's kind of like the opposite genetic filtering here, where most of our elite athletes seem to be these small sweaters. And then there's the rest of us, which we call the sub-elite. And I'm not saying that you're not elite in any way. You could be very, very, very good runner, but we count elite, these guys running Jim Walmsley, Zach Bitters, the guys in the Olympics, these guys. And in a little bit, you'll see why they do so well. I can guarantee that most of us in this room probably don't fit the small sweater category. We're probably big sweaters, and you probably all have a story when in a race, whether it's a 5K, 10K, half marathon, ultra, whatever, where you've blown up and you've probably overheated and become dehydrated. It's because I found when I came into this field as well, when I looked into all the research, I was like, I need to figure this out for these guys. Like, I need to figure out this problem. When you get nerdy research academics, they go and they study people. They're generally studying elite athletes. So the people that they're studying are these guys over here, which are these small sweaters, which doesn't necessarily apply to all us cobblers just having a crack at it and trying to make the most of it. So I found myself working with lots of different runners trying to apply these principles to these guys, and it just wasn't working. Then I got out there and got competitive and started running, and then I saw everyone else around me struggling and DNFing and dropping out because they're trying to apply these principles to themselves. And once I go through this, it should make it very, very obvious that there's a very, very, very big difference on how you should approach this. So let's just take this for example. These are actually 2 studies that we do from 2 athletes that we look after. Very, very elite person. They sweat about 750 mils per hour, 500 milligrams of sodium they lose. Don't worry about that. We'll talk about that in a little bit more. They're about 80 kilos, so that 750 mil loss is less than 1%. So in my world, that's not a lot of sweat per hour that they're gonna lose. They generally just intuitively drink about 600 mils, so they get most of that back. Whereas Old Love over here, actually I want to pick names. I need names for these guys. I need a name for the guy. Steve, good one. I need a name for the lady. Camille. Okay. Camille, that's different. I've done this a few times. I've never heard Camille before. It's usually like Lucy or Louise. All right, so Camille loses 1.5 kilos per hour of sweat, 1,000 milligrams. We'll worry about that in a bit. She's 60 kilos body weight. So 1.5 liters for her is about 2% of her body weight. In my world, that's a lot. That's what I class as a big sweater. So then what we can do, our teams kind of map this process out where we have these equations where we can go through with our athletes and kind of predict where they're going to bonk. Now, there's obviously a lot of factors that come into this. You can change your strategy, temperature changes throughout the day, you're going to drink more at certain hours, blah, blah, blah. An aid station has something tasty, you'll probably eat it, blah, blah. I get it. Let's just, theoretically, we map this out, and this is what happens. So if you take these 2 people and say they're both running a 100-kilometer race, let's say it takes about 14 hours, they're pretty good, both pretty good, they're going to have 2 very, very different experiences based purely on the dehydration that they experience. So old mate Steve here is going to be running through, and because he's replacing most of that fluid that he's losing, he's never really going to get, to 3% dehydrated, just a little bit above 2%. Where we've got our friend Camille over here, she's on a very different story. She's having a very, very different experience. She's sweating a lot, even though she's putting it back in. She's read online, I've got to replace a litre per hour, I've got to do that, but she's just not matching those rates. She's going to end up very, 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 very dehydrated. What really brings this home is when you interlace on top of this, what happens at these levels of dehydration. So at just 2% dehydration, you can lose up to 5% of your performance capacity. If you're a responder to dehydration, there's responders, non-responders, that can be as high as 20% if you're really, really touch sensitive with dehydration. That's just 2%. So almost instantly, our friend Camille is approaching that just after a couple of hours. When we get to about 5% dehydrated, we can lose up to 50% of our performance capability. This is things like your max power, max strength, reaction time, your ability to concentrate, make decisions, things like that. So by the time she gets about 6 hours in, she's doing 50% of the output of what she did when she started, purely because she's getting that dehydrated. Keep in mind, she's still drinking, she thinks she's doing everything right. If we get up to about 7%, that puts you at high risk of what we call heat illness. That's heat exhaustion and heat stroke. They can kill you. If you get heat stroke and that doesn't get addressed, you can get really, really bad. If we get up to past 10%, around 11%, and this is kind of the area in my other life that I play with these guys, with these fighters, I kind of hang out in this area quite a lot. But if you get up there in an ultra endurance race, you're gonna need urgent medical care. You're in a hospital bed, you need an IV, and you need someone who knows what they're doing to get you back, or you're in a very, very bad state. And if you look at Camille's race against Steve's race here, Steve is kind of having a good time. I would be very, very surprised if Camille was able to get past that 6 hour mark. To add on top of this, and again, this is just hydration, right? There's lots of other things that happen during a race. One of the biggest things you need to do, everyone who's done one knows you have to eat. You have to take on calories to get through. The more you fuel, the more you go. When we get to about 5% dehydration, our gut integrity decreases, which means our gut just gets dehydrated. So that means that we just physically can't take on the carbs, we can't take on protein, we can't take on that fluid. So if you hit that 5%, you've already started a downward spiral there. And Camille's hitting that pretty soon. So 6 hours from there, not only is she seeing all these other negative effects of dehydration, now she can't eat, she can't take on carbs, she can't push through, she's probably throwing up, she's probably crapped herself a couple times. Her gut's not too good. So the thing is like that paints a very doom and gloom picture, right? But the thing is, most of you guys are probably around about the same ballpark as Camille. But that doesn't mean that you can't be a good runner, you can't get through it, because lots of people are big sweaters and they get through these races. If you're this person, this is the person that you'll see on a race that'll annoy the shit out of you. Because you'll go to them and you'll say, hey, what's your strategy? And they'll go, I don't know, man, I'll drink a bit of this, I'll drink a bit of that. Oh, that looks good at the aid station, I'll have this. You know, I'll try, oh, look at that, they cooked this. And they'll be fine because their gut integrity is good. They're not that dehydrated. Where people like myself and a lot of you and Camille, if we touch the wrong drink at an aid station, we're crapping ourselves, we've got cramps, something not good is going to come. So two very, very different strategies you have to take for these guys. And there's three things you have to do. You have to understand what your sweat rate is per hour. You have to understand what your salt losses are per hour. You have to understand what that means as an actual replacement strategy. So your sweat rate, very, very intuitive. It's just how much you're sweating per hour. How much fluid do you lose out of your body per hour? I encourage all you guys, whether you're recreational athletes, serious, whatever level you guys are at, do this. Keep a journal. What you do is before your session, weigh yourself. After your session, weigh yourself, account for all the fluid that you've drunk. Obviously do it butt naked because you don't want to get your clothes, they're going to get heavier and sweatier, etc. Pretty self-explanatory, right? Sweat rate. Everyone should be doing this, and you should be doing this across different sessions. If you've got a tempo session Wednesday, do it then, see what happens. If you've got a midweek long run and it goes for an hour, hour and a half, do it then. Your 3 hour long run on Saturday, do it then. Because your sweat rate will change over time. You'll sweat a lot at the start and it'll slow down, and you should have a good understanding of how that changes over time. Next thing is your sodium sweat rate. Anyone here ever done a sweat test and ever done a sodium sweat test? Yeah. They're not that accurate. Sorry to burst your bubble. They're not that accurate. I have a kit. I could come down here and we could organize it. The number itself is not that important. It's how you put it into context with all of this. When I when I do this with my athletes, I'm not necessarily looking and going, hey, this is like a 1500 milligram per blah, blah, blah. I'm pretty much just categorizing them and saying, is this low, medium, or high? If you've had this done, low I count as about 500 milligrams, medium about 1,000 to 12, anything above 1,500 is very, very high. A lot of our high sweaters will get up to about 2,000 milligrams. Very, very different strategy than if you have someone who's a 500 milligram sweater. I would encourage you guys, if you are serious about it, go get it, look at the number, because it does inform this strategy and it informs this number quite a bit. Now, a lot what you'll read, and when people talk about this, and they'll go, okay, how much do I need to drink? And you'll read a lot of info and you go, I drink 1 litre per hour, or just replace your sweat losses. And you go, okay, that's fine. But when you put that into practice and reality, your stomach can only handle so much. Like, we work with lots of athletes where they say they're losing 1.5 to 2 litres. They can't replace 1.5, 2 litres every single hour. That's tough. And if you guys run and if you try to do it, it's really hard. Some people can, and you can train your gut to do that. A lot of people can't. So then what you need to understand then is it's not a straight number. When we look at people like Steve who aren't losing that much, they can probably replace a much higher percentage of their losses. But when you look at that lady like Camille who's losing lots and lots, they're replacing such a lower percentage of their losses. So you can't replace the exact amount. Say if Camille's losing 1.5 litres and she's losing 1,000 milligrams of sodium every hour, but she can only put back in, say, 500 mils, she can't be putting back in the same amount of salt that's losing in that big amount, because it's going to mix up everything. It's going to upset the balance. So you need to have a very good strategy. A general rule of thumb is that you only ever really need electrolytes if you can replace 70% or more of your fluid. And that's weird coming from a guy who runs an electrolyte company that's trying to sell you electrolytes, but I'll get there. So we're going to go kind of deep in this, and I apologize if I run over time, but this is info I wish I had when I started running. Every single runner should know this stuff, because it'll be the difference between you DNFing a race and you getting through it. So you need to understand 3 principles, is that your body doesn't understand how much water it has based on how much water it has in it. The way your body works is that it measures the saltiness of the water in it. So we've got kidneys back here, well, most of us should have 2 kidneys back there. Every minute of every single day, water's going through them. They've got receptors that are banging off, and they're going, hey, this is like the saltiness of the water. So if we look at this cup, so say that's like the ideal amount of salt. Can everyone see that? Ideal amount of salt, right? So what your body does, every single day it goes, okay, this is ideal, I like this amount, everything is good. Let's keep our body in balance. Our body loves things in balance. So let's say that we do this and I grab this big bottle of water and then I drink that whole bottle of water. What happens to this? Is I put it in here, what's then happened to the salt that's in this? We've diluted it, right? So how would our body then get that back to balance, to get it back to that saltiness that we wanted? We would have to get rid of the water that we put in. So that's why when you drink that big bottle of water just during the day, your kidneys will filter it through, they'll detect it and go, oh, we've diluted that balance. I need to get it back. I'm going to pee out. That's why you go to the bathroom and your pee is clear. The opposite will also work. Say if we had a little bit and we were a little bit of water and we had the same amount of salt in there, put the same amount. Everyone could appreciate that if we mix that up, it's not even going to mix because it's so concentrated. So it's really, really concentrated. The only situation where you're going to get this is if we lose a lot of the fluid out of there and we keep the salt. So if you're sweating, you're going to get a very, very concentrated water levels in your body. That's going to filter through your kidneys. Your kidneys are going to go, ah, shit, this is really, really salty. I must not have, hello, Danny. We must not have a lot of water. What are you going to do? You're going to hold it. So you're going to hold the water, and that's why when you go to the bathroom, it's really, really dark because you're peeing out everything else, not as much water. That's a very important concept that you guys need to understand to get through this, okay? Next thing you need to know is that when you sweat, you don't just sweat water. We lose electrolytes. The primary one that we're going to lose is something called sodium, which we call salt. So we'll refer to it as salt from now on, don't need to know sodium. And the other thing that we need to know is that, particularly important if you're an ultra endurance athlete here, if you sweat for long periods of time, there's probably a good chance that you're continually swapping between these balances, right? Like if you're constantly sweating for say 13 hours and then you're just drinking random amounts of fluid at all the aid stations, there's a good chance that every now and then you're swapping these balances. Those are the three things we need to have our head around before we keep going. The next thing we need to understand is where water is in our body. This is a very funny concept because when you ask people, where is the water? They go, I don't really know. Water is in all different compartments and how our body handles it is very, very different. But the most important place that our body has water is in our blood. Anyone ever ran out of oil in the car before? We all know what happens. Have you guys ever met a human that doesn't have any blood in their body? They probably did at their funeral. So they're probably not doing too well. Your body has water in its brain, all the organs, it has water in muscles, it has water everywhere. Where it wants to protect the most is the blood. So your body will do whatever it can to put water back into your blood so you can keep pumping oxygen around, nutrients, getting waste products out, getting those energy, those carbs to your working muscles. Your body will do whatever it can to keep the water in the blood. It's 55% blood, 55% water, and it'll try as best as it can to keep the integrity of that water in the blood. Just like a car, oil in a car, very, very, very important for you to function properly. This is where it starts getting juicy. This is going to tie together. When we sweat, does anyone know when we go outside and where we sweat, where the water comes from on your skin? If I nicked my skin right now, I'd start to bleed. That's because we've got little capillaries all up and down under our skin. So when we sweat, what's actually happening is our core body temperature goes up. Some little part of our brain goes, oh crap, this guy's getting really hot. Over millions of years, we've evolved to have this really cool mechanism, which is called sweating. What that does is that it innervates all of our millions of sweat glands. What the sweat does is it tells fluid to go from our blood just onto the edge of our skin. And then what that fluid does is it evaporates, so it turns into a gas, into the atmosphere around us. And to be able to do that and turn into a gas, it needs to take heat from our body. And so by taking the heat and doing that over millions of sweat glands, we eventually bring that core body temperature down. But what you need to understand is that sweat and that fluid is coming from our blood. And where's the most important place in our body that we need fluid? Our blood. So if we're sweating for long periods of time, this is why it messes us up pretty bad, because we're losing fluid from the part of our body that we need the most. Now this is going to get a little weird, and I want you guys to bear with me. This can get a little bit sciencey. I'm going to break it down, but this is one of the most important things you need to wrap your head around, especially if you're like Camille, like I was. So this concept was something I've been running for only about 3-4 years. I've DNF'd in 2 races, and it's because I did not understand this. I tried to apply a strategy that was made for Steve-O, old mate Steve, and apply it to myself, when really it was apples and oranges, and I should have taken the old Camille approach. So in our blood, we appreciate blood's really important. It's 55% water. In our blood, we have electrolytes. Our main electrolyte is sodium. Everyone following? If you went to the doctor right now and you get a complete blood count, they're going to give you how much sodium you have in your blood. You don't need to know what these numbers mean. These numbers in the middle, 137, 144, don't need to know. You just need to know that's normal. If you go under that, it's called a condition called hyponatremia, which all it means is low sodium in your blood. If you go under it. If you go higher than it, it's called hypernatremia, which means high sodium in your blood. So if you look at the signs and symptoms of what you experience when you have low sodium in your blood, nausea, vomiting, headaches, cramps, blurred vision, seizures, comas, pretty bad. It's probably a good chance that some of you guys, not a lot, some of you guys probably experience this at a race at some point. And if you look over here and you go, okay, high sodium, what do we see when we get there? Excessive thirst, irritability, get a bit incoherent, fatigue, seizures, coma. So at either end of the normal, it's pretty bad. It's pretty bad. What you need to know for this is that you will very, very likely end up in one of these situations based on how much you sweat. So if we look at old mate Steve here, remember, he wasn't sweating a lot. He wasn't losing a lot. He wasn't losing a lot of fluid. So what old mate Steve, if he's running and he's drinking a lot of water every time he goes to his crew, he goes, hey, have some water. He's going to end up in this situation where he keeps putting in water, he's going to end up diluting that blood salt. Very, very common. This guy had it the other day. I didn't tell him, but he had it when I shoved 4 pills in your mouth because he's experiencing these signs because he's a lower sweater. You're drinking a lot of fluid, you dilute it, and that's a completely different strategy to get out of that compared to our friend Camille over here, the reason she gets high blood sodium, very, very concentrated, is because she keeps losing fluid and she's only putting in a little bit. Loses more, puts in a little bit. Loses more, puts in a little bit. It gets very, very concentrated. So you go, why is this important? What the heck? And you go, maybe not for a half marathon, maybe not for a marathon. If you guys do ultra marathons, you need to know this, because the strategy how you get out of that is very different. So if Steve ends up in that position where he's got low sodium, the only way to get him out is to give him more salt. If you give him more water, you could put him in a coma and he'll start being in a very, very bad spot. We've seen this in marathons a lot of the time. There's been documented deaths quite a lot where people will run in a very cold environment. They're used to training in a hot environment. They're habitually drinking, say, a litre an hour, and then they'll just drop dead. It's because they're experiencing this low blood sodium. A lot of ultra marathons, you see people go to the hospital and they do their blood tests and they end up having high blood sodium because they're losing way too much than what they can replace, even though they've read and been told, just drink a litre and you'll be good, you'll be right. Then they're not right. They've got high blood sodium, which is very not okay. And the way that you get around that is you don't actually use too many electrolytes. You can replace water. So the thing that will be absolutely detrimental to this person over here is the fix for this person over here. And this is why I bang on so much and say, hey, you need to come in and have an individual assessment, because I found myself in this position trying to apply that strategy for myself who's over here, and that's what ended me up in the emergency room, being told my kidneys are shutting down. Very, very bad. So again, I did this with Toby. Again, just reiterating that. Toby was drinking a lot, we were good, we were on there. It cooled down, the temperature dropped massively. We went from about, 15, 16 degrees down to 9, 10 degrees. His sweat rate dropped. Toby's really good, he pees a lot, but we ended up putting a bit too much fluid in. It was a couple, 30 something hours in, however many we were, I probably wasn't thinking. And then he goes, when he turns, he goes, I'm getting this splitting headache behind my right ear. I don't know if you remember this. And I go, fuck, I know what that means. And because I was watching him, because every 10 minutes he'd stop and do a pee, which is normal for him, I'm okay with it, as long as we're getting salt. And I thought, I've slipped up, I haven't given him salt for a little while. I went, shit, he's in hyponatremia. And I was like, this could get really bad if we don't fix this straight away. So I went to the crew, didn't say anything, I said, give me 4 salt tablets. Went up to him and shoved them in his mouth. I said, don't ask, just put it in. And I said, and then I don't know if you realize this, I didn't give him water for another hour because I needed him to sweat out water so he could come back and be back in this balance. Once we got through that, we're all good. As good as you can be 30 whatever hours deep in that situation. The other situation where a lot of people will be in is when you're in high blood sodium. The goal is not to get more salt in there. If you've got highly salty blood, the worst thing you can do is whack more salt in your body. You're gonna actually draw more fluid out, you're probably gonna crap yourself, and you're gonna make this problem even worse. What you need to do is get fluid in there. That is why we created this, because when our fighters were cutting weight, we figured out after they were drastically dehydrated, we found that they all had this type of blood sodium. And I guess I am here to plug a product, kinda. So I do have to talk about this. This is why Trainade works really well. And I'm not gonna take all the credit for it because I didn't formulate it, even though I will. I take a lot of the credit. The guy who formulated this is a guy called Dr. Lewis James from Loughborough University. Dr. Lewis James has worked with guys like Kipchoge and lots of other very, very, very famous marathon runners. Lewis, back in the day, was a metalhead. Metalhead loved MMA and he trained with all these crazy, now very, very famous UFC people. I connected with Lewis and I remember him coming on my podcast and talking to me, and I said, Lewis, I've got this problem. I've got my fighters who are in this weird state. I want to rehydrate them. These are the things that I used to use. You go into the hotel room, I'm mixing up what I was trying to get this in a hotel room, sleep deprived, with my beakers, with my measuring cups with salt. And he goes, I had that problem for years. He goes, I actually wanted to look into it. I just could never get funding for fighting because no one cared about fighting. No one really cares about fighting now. I definitely am over it. But now he's like, but then he goes, I've had to put all my research, that's all I've been funded to do in marathon running, but I've got all these formulas that I think you could work with. And he goes, you see, I'll be honest, I said to him, I'm probably gonna commercialize this and make a couple bucks. You want something from this? And he goes, nah, well, it's better you have it than it just sit in my desk. And that's how we came up with this formula. And the reason why we came up with this. It's not to put in lots of salt in your body. It's not to make sure you've got a highly salty drink. The ratio that we made this is to rapidly move fluid from your gut into your blood. If you were ever in this state, in that high salt state, and you went to the hospital, what's the first thing they're gonna do? They're gonna put an IV in you, because that gets fluid directly in your blood. If you don't have access to an IV, we're not allowed to use it with the fighters. If you're out in an ultra marathon, you probably could if you're pretty inventive, you could get it done. Yeah, if you get it done, like that's probably pretty smart. Yeah, with the pole, run with it. But this is the next best thing. This is the next best thing. You need something that can rapidly move fluid from your gut to your blood. So that's why we created this. And then this is what I mean when I said, I found myself solving this problem for the fighters, and then I went, oh crap, the ultra marathon guys are almost all in the same problem. So when we give this out to them, it's not so much that we're saying, hey, get all this salt and replace the salt. What we're doing is we're rapidly moving fluid, and what that's doing is it's diluting their blood from that and then putting fluid very quickly and getting it back to balance. And it's doing that very, very fast. That's why a lot of guys, when they have this, say, when they wake up in the morning and they're dehydrated, they go, oh, I feel really good. You go, yeah, because you just really fast got the fluid where it needed to go. After training, you've dehydrated a bit. Okay, I need to get the fluid back in really fast. Have that, it moves it back in. And if I'm being honest, if I work with athletes, I don't recommend it to everyone, because for people like Camille, this would be really good because it would get the fluid back in really fast. People like Steve, they're probably better suited just drinking a really carby drink or something like that. But every single day, that's why I guess we wanted to call it everyday hydration, because the reasoning for it is that it moves that fluid so fast back into the blood and it can restore that balance really, really quick. And as much as I want to take credit for it, I've got to give Lewis the credit he does deserve. So before I wrap this up, and I know we're going a bit over time, I want to just quickly go through, and if you're thinking, oh man, that's great info, but like what does it do? I'll talk you through both of those, Camille and Steve, and then what I would do if they come in. Well, I guess I did do this because they are clients and they came in, and the difference that it makes if you just do those 3 steps. You get their sweat rate, you figure out the sweat losses, and you figure out the replacement, and you give them a strategy. So if you look at old mate Steve here, what we did is there's 750 mil loss. Okay, let's bump that to just 700 mil. We don't want to go too much because we're going to get that dangerous area where we'll dilute everything. 700 mil is really good, 93% replacement. And then we're going to replace about 93-ish% of the sodium. We're not going to do that just with electrolyte drinks. Obviously, when you're out there, you're eating other things, taking other supplements, whatever that has enough sodium. This is pretty much what we did, and this is the result that we got. So we kept this healthy blood the whole way through. We didn't go too low because we were appropriately replacing it. And then look at this. He started in originally 2.5%, which isn't bad, which is not bad at all. But then by doing these small little changes, we got him to losing less than 1%. And if you ever look at these guys and you're like UTMB this year, and you look at guys like Walmsley, who are sprinting 100 miles, and you're thinking how could they possibly do that? Yes, they're exceptionally fit. Yes, they've trained really well, mental strategies, all of that. But there's no way a human can possibly do that if they don't have this down pat. And you look at them at the aid stations and they're just constantly taking on huge amounts of fuel. Huge amount. Zach Bitter, exactly the same, sprints through. There's no way they can keep that intensity without keeping their levels of dehydration really low. Otherwise, their system shuts down. So this is why I also say that this strategy is pretty much reserved for these top elite level guys, and that's probably going to push them up to that 1%. That's probably something Jim worked on from coming second at UTMB all those years to coming back and winning, because I don't know, maybe it's the nutritionist in me watching it going, he is taking on a lot of fuel every time he goes to these aid stations. And again, it's not that much of a change, but that could be the difference between these guys winning these big events and not. And then you go, okay, what about the everyday person like Camille? That's probably most of us, sub-elite, big sweaters, probably can't keep up as much. What do you do with them? And you go, okay, well, first we need to see what can your stomach actually handle. Most people aren't going to be able to handle more than 1.5. 1.2 seems to be the sweet spot. You can train your gut for more. 1.2 is a good spot. That's where we started with her. So that means we're replacing 75% of the fluids. Means we're going to replace about 75% of the salts. Needing to remember and respect that she is continually, as she keeps going, she's going to be dropping more and more as she goes. Even though we're doing well, she's getting more and more dehydrated, and we're changing that. So what we did with her strategy is we changed the fluids and the sodium as she went on. We did less sodium as she went further on. We were able to keep that blood sodium level, even though she would have maybe went high salt. We were able to stop that by swapping over from highly salty drinks into just plain water. And if you look at this, she's still finishing about 6% dehydrated, which isn't ideal, but it's a whole lot better than her finishing 12% dehydrated. That's the difference between her crossing the line, getting in a fire blanket, maybe throwing up once or twice, but still going home and having a beer with her friends and family and whatever. And then that's the difference between her going to hospital and being in ICU, essentially, just from making those small little changes. So there's lots of factors that affect this. I've kind of simplified this, and I know even that listening to this info, I could present this to a room full of qualified sports nutritionists and they would still be scratching their head, giving me the look you guys are giving me, going, that was a bit much. But there's lots of factors that affect this. The weather, your clothing that you wear, your pacing, whether you're just trying to survive that race or whether you're really gunning it and going hard. And the food you consume. Food contains salt, and that can often throw people off not knowing how much salt that they're putting in. And the other thing is that you can have the perfect strategy, but then you might have to tweak it. Say if you go to North America and it's a very cool, dry environment, you're all of a sudden not sweating, you have to have a completely different strategy to suit that. So 3 things to do your own hydration strategy before I let you guys go. Just calculate your hourly sweat rate. Go out there, do it across a week. Keep a journal before, after, all these different sessions. Start to understand how much you're actually losing. I encourage you, go get a sweat test, go get a sodium sweat test. Maybe I'll chat to Jamie, bring the machine down, and we can do this here. And then thirdly, chat to someone about getting a replacement strategy that suits you. And again, yes, there's a lot of science behind this, but I'm talking from very personal experience. Both times I've DNF'd in these ultra marathons were because I was trying to apply old mate Steve's strategy when I'm very much a Camille. I'm very much a sub-elite, very newbie runner who was trying to apply the elite athlete strategy, and it just didn't work. And I ended up one time DNFing, and then the second time I was in hospital, which I hear this story so many times as well. So again, very last thing, try it out and adjust. You can have all the theory, you can have all the idea in the world. There's lots of factors that affect this. Try it out and adjust. Do it well before your race. Do it while you're out of season. Do it when you don't have a race booked in. Just try around with it, play around. Once you get this right, and at least for me, this is when running kind of became fun. Like running used to be this terrible sport that was just I was mentally very challenging. I hated it. And I was like, how could anyone enjoy doing this? And then I figured this out and I was like, this ain't too bad. This is pretty good. But it's all just changing my approach. Instead of going for oranges, I had to go for apples. It's just getting an individual plan. So I know that dragged on a little bit. That's a lot to take in. You can take a minute and try to absorb that. But if there's any immediate questions, feel free to throw your hand up. Otherwise, I'll hang around for a bit if you don't want to ask out loud. But thank you guys for listening. That's a lot going on. I know I dragged on, sorry Jamie, for a while, but yeah, thank you so much guys. Any questions or, yeah.
This came up in a ride on the weekend.
Yep.
So there was someone doing a long ride training for a half Ironman or an Ironman, and they had 2 bottles, one with water and one was Powerade or something, and they said, oh yeah, I just whacked 10 scoops in, so it's super concentrated because if I'm doing a race specific session, I can't change my bottles. How effective or ineffective is that? Because I don't know, I've heard of people doing it a lot. It's oh, I've just got one bottle, won't be able to change it. I'm just going to really jack this up.
Yeah, I mean, 2 ways to answer it. Depends, is he a Steve or a Camille? If he's a Steve, he can get away with drinking whatever, and we all know that person. You can kind of do not completely whatever, but you get away with a lot more than what us normies can't. The other thing, if you're whacking a lot of that, you need to remember water follows salt, and this is a big problem. Whenever I give these talks, people come back and they go, oh, you know what, I'm going to get these really salty drinks. That's the solution. You go, yeah, maybe it is, and then they have it, and then all of a sudden they just crap their pants. you get what's called osmotic diarrhea, which is pretty much watery diarrhea. Salt will just pull water. It's the opposite of what this does essentially. This pushes water from your gut into your blood. If you have a very, very high salt, like 10 scoops or whatever, they can push it the other way. It can be really bad. But again, it might, maybe there's a situation where he's a really, really high sweater. He can drink like 2 liters of water. And then maybe, yeah, okay, it warrants him having 2,000 milligrams. I haven't seen too many people like that, but I would say he probably had a pretty upset tummy afterwards. Any other cues?
Any questions? I'm going to go here. I've got a question.
Yeah.
So you're talking about all your testing and all the salt versus all that sort of thing. What about acclimatisation? So if we're training in this humidity and we're heading over to Europe to do a race, should we apply our training, like our testing principles in that, or does the body have to adjust for a certain period of time?
Yeah, 2 weeks to heat acclimate. So it's got, I know I was away for a bit. If I don't know if you guys have been here the whole time, it's been super humid in the human sauna, but 2 weeks it'll take you adjust, and it's called like heat acclimation. So after that, what actually happens is the fluid in your blood will adjust. That's why it seems so much easier, is that the percentage of fluid you have in your blood will adjust. That's why you can take on more fluids and you sweat more efficiently. But yeah, 2 weeks, and you should be practicing. Like if you've got Western states coming up and you're training in the middle of winter in Australia, you probably need to go somewhere where it's hot for at least 2 weeks so your body can get used to handling that heat, and then you can get your hydration and fueling strategy on point. Otherwise, you're just going to end up going out there and be like, crap, this doesn't work because I've been practicing in the completely wrong environment.
Well, can you cheat it a bit by, if you need a high level of sodium and you haven't acclimatised for it, can you increase the amount of sodium to cheat it, or is that just won't work?
I doubt it would work because I doubt that would work. You'd probably shit yourself. Yeah.
Need to extend your holiday.
Yeah. You probably need to extend your holiday a little bit. Yeah. But
I have some feedback. So I've got a client, he's 21, and he did his first marathon at the Gold Coast this year, and then he decided he wanted to do the GC25 or GC50 25 pound weekend. And he works up in roofs, like doing installing air conditioning or he's an electrician, I think. And so I got him to Trainade, and he said it's made such a huge difference for him because he's like sweating all day, and then he goes and stacks shelves of police job. So he said that the energy that he's got now compared to what he used to have is amazing. And then on the weekend, he like smashed the 25 and he made it like it was even hot, but everyone else was working through. So I think it was the hottest one they've had almost.
Yeah.
So I guess he's also heat acclimatized from working in it, but the Trainade basically it's helping.
yeah, and I mean for some people it works really well. Like I know it's weird, like, I should be selling this, but like before I created a supplement company, like I was a performance dietitian. I kind of have to. If I don't stick to that, then they take away my registration and everything. So like for some people, this is like amazing, and some people it's just not necessary. And I'm not gonna like say that it's necessary for everyone, especially when it comes to racing. But I think like your everyday, like my brother runs a roofing company in Perth where they're constantly up there for 40 degrees, and we just send him boxes and boxes of it. Again, it's not because they're like sweating to the extent you do in a marathon or ultra marathon. It's just that I appreciate that they're going to lose a lot of fluid out of their blood, and we need to get their back really, really fast. And that's what the job of this is. So
Geordie, we all know people who have terrible cramping. You know, every race they do, they complete body cramp, end up falling in the bushes, can't move, etc.
yeah.
Is that more likely to be too much sodium or not enough sodium?
As it stands right now, in my personal opinion, again, I've had a very weird professional experience with this because for about 5 years of my life, I took people to death's door by dehydrating them and then rehydrated them. Like I don't know if you guys have ever seen what weight cutting is and seen what people look like after. It's horrendous. They're basically a corpse. We rarely see cramping with that. When we see cramping, it's generally up above here at about 8, 9, 10% dehydration. And it's usually when there's some type of heat factor involved. So guys who are running in the heat seems to be a thing. So when we were cutting weight with these fighters, and if we were in a sauna or a hot bath or something like that, it seemed that would be more. But cramping as it stands isn't so much an electrolyte imbalance. That's something that's probably not true because you've got a lot of sodium in your body. You're not gonna imbalance, like none of those things where I spoke about low sodium in the blood, high sodium is cramping an issue. Where cramping becomes an issue, one, the biggest theory is with it, you just didn't condition yourself. You didn't come down here and do your strength conditioning. You didn't run the hills, and then all of a sudden you got to do 10,000 meters of vert and elevation, and you've only used to doing 2,000. That's probably going to bring it on. Or you get severe dehydration. And I've had whole body cramps. They're terrifying, and they can kill you. They can kill you. Your heart can stop. But that's up about this 10% dehydration. The reason when we promote that this helps relieve cramps, not for the fact that it has sodium or electrolytes coming back in, but more for the fact that it'll push that water back into the area that we need to prevent you getting severely dehydrated. So I hope that answers it.
Yeah, no, definitely.
Yeah.
And, I've had coaches who've said the same thing. If you're cramping, it's because you weren't conditioned. You
Yeah.
didn't train correctly.
Yeah, and I've seen that across pretty much every sport, whether it's AFL, cricket, tennis. Tennis is a really big one when they get into those matches and it goes 5 sets, and that, you can't really mimic that in training when you're at the Aussie Open or whatever, or Wimbledon, and you're going that hard. You can't really mimic that in training. So now you're 6 hours deep and you haven't been there, so that's when the cramping starts. And the banana on the sideline probably isn't helping that much. All right, I think so. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you, buddy.
Thank you guys. Appreciate it.